Most outdoor photographers choose the wrong aperture and overall overcomplicate the process of choosing one. Hi, I'm Hugo. I travel and photograph the world full time, and I help outdoor photographers go from button clickers into storytelling photographers. In this video, I'll go through what aperture is, what aperture to choose, and why. I'll keep this as simple as possible. Most photographers absolutely overcomplicate this subject. But before we dive in, if you haven't checked out Focus Notes, my newsletter where I share exclusive insights from my photography journey, make sure to join us from the link in the description. Alright, so most photographers indeed absolutely overcomplicate the subject of aperture. This can be so much more simple than they make it out to be. But there was a day where I didn't know aperture either, and that wasn't fun. And if you don't know what aperture is exactly and how to use it, then you will ruin some amazing photographs. So I will keep this video as simple as possible, because if you're anything like me, you want things to be as simple as possible. So let's start with how aperture affects the exposure. Here is already where this could get very complicated if I did explain this like most photographers do. Most photographers say an aperture can be wider and faster, or then smaller and slower. But that is just very complicated to wrap your head around, so I'm not going to use any of those terms. I will call aperture as an f-stop. So when it comes to exposure, the higher the f-stop number is, the less light there will be, and the smaller the f-stop number is, the more light there will be. We're gonna keep it that simple, okay? So, examples. If you choose f22, then your photo will be darker compared to if you used f4. That's all you need to know how this affects the exposure. So the higher the f-stop number is, the less light there will be, and the smaller the f-stop number is, the more light there will be. Okay? Isn't that very simple? We're gonna keep it like that. Understand that aperture is one of the things that you need to then kind of balance out with shutter speed and ISO. My recommendation is that you choose aperture first, because this does affect also, indeed, the message that you're telling, and then you select the other settings. Aperture first. So yeah, but that's what you should know about exposure when it comes to aperture. Very simple, right? Then let's go ahead and now talk what this means in terms of focus. The higher your f-stop number is, the more there's gonna be in focus. The smaller your f-stop number is, the smaller amount of the photo will be in focus. Simple, right? So to recap, the higher your f-stop number is, the higher amount of the photo will be in focus. And the smaller the f-stop number is, the smaller amount of the photo will be in focus. Here at some point I'm gonna put some examples on the screen, so you're gonna see like the difference. For example, if you choose an f4, then there's gonna be some elements likely that is gonna be showing out of focus, especially if you are close to something, such as in this photo. But then if you choose a higher f-stop number, then likely you're gonna have a lot of the photo, if not everything in the photo, in focus. Okay? Isn't that rather simple? I hope so. So to recap what we've gone through so far. The higher the f-stop number is, the darker the photograph will be, and the more of the photograph will be in focus. The smaller the f-stop number is, the brighter the photo will be, and the smaller amount of the photo will be in focus. Okay, so that's how aperture overall works. Next up is important to understand focus stacking. What is focus stacking? Focus stacking is where you take multiple exposures, usually 2, and you change the focus between the photos. For example, you could take one photograph of a sky and then another one of the foreground. This is something that I don't typically like doing because I like to keep my photography as simple as possible, but sometimes it just is kind of necessary, or then your photograph won't come out as you like it to be. For example, when I took some non-light photographs, I do first focus on a star to get the sky in focus. But then when I do that, the foreground isn't in focus, and especially if I have something important there, like I usually do, like a person, then it's important the person is also sharp, because otherwise the photo will just look like it's out of focus and it's weird. So that's why I do take 2 exposures, sometimes in these cases, and then I combine the focused points of the photograph into one photograph in post-production. Now this is too technical to go through in this video, but that's like what is focus stacking. So in some cases you should use this. For example, if you indeed have a big difference between where's the foreground and the background, then you might not get everything focused in one photo. So then if you do want to get the detail in both the background and the foreground, then you should consider taking 2 photos and then combining them together later. Now you could do this handheld in theory, and I have done that, but it's much more simple if you do have a tripod for these kind of situations, because it's easier to align than everything. So, but that's what's focus stacking. Next up, what's important to understand is now how Aperture affects the story. This is the thing why I recommend you to choose Aperture first before shutter speed and ISO. Because Aperture makes for a big difference what your photograph communicates. Because it decides kind of like what is in focus, right? And how much of the photo will be in focus. And this changes the meaning of the photograph. Really think about this consciously. That what do you want in focus? Because that's gonna change the message. Now, this alone won't make you a great storyteller. Unfortunately, that overall getting settings right is important. It's crucial, or then your photos just won't, well, have potential to be great. But most people stop at settings and think like of aperture and shutter speed and ISO. But then you are just a button clicker. You need to learn the storytelling side to be great. And if you do want to dive deeper into storytelling and you want to go from a button clicker into a storytelling photographer, then I might be able to help you inside my photography mentorship, Storylands. There I do help outdoor photographers like you. So if you do want to apply to work with me, then DM me on Instagram with ready to apply. Or if you don't have Instagram, then just click the link in the description. Alright, then next up, let's go through how Aperture actually affects sharpness. This is kind of good to know. It's not the most important point, but I think it's very good to know, especially if you have invested a lot into gear. You want to make sure you are getting the, well, sharpest photos possible, getting most out of your gear. So what aperture you choose is gonna also affect how good quality photos you are getting. For example, many don't use f/22 because then your photograph won't be as good quality. Now, meaning it's not going to be as sharp. And then one might not use like f/1.4 or f/2 because then typically the photo is going to be also not as sharp as it could be. Where is the like sharpest point in with your lens? That's gonna depend on your lens. But there's a certain aperture that your lens is the sharpest at. And typically these fall between like f4 and like f16, like somewhere there. So like you shouldn't use either end, like a extremely open, like f2 or something, and then also not really like f22. But yeah, it depends from lens to lens. So what I do recommend is that you would go into the website I have linked in the description. It's called DxOMark. Yes, DxOMark. And on there you can type in your lens or lenses, and it might have information on your lens, and you'll be able to see based on tests that what aperture is your lens the sharpest at. And then you will know. So don't do that now. Do it then after this video, okay? Because we still have other things to go through. So don't jump off yet. But next up, let's go through that. Why would you use f22 at times? Because there is a reason for that. A good timing for that. One great timing is, for example, when you do photograph the sun. Now, many people say, oh, don't photograph straight to the sun. But sometimes it looks cool, and you should do it if you think it looks cool. And in that case, you could consider using f22. Because when you use f22, then there's going to be a sun-star effect, like in this photo, for example. So the sun will look kind of cooler. But you shouldn't always use f22. You have to make sure that when you photograph the sun, that the sun being like a sun-star actually does benefit the photograph. And in some cases it doesn't, and then you shouldn't use f22. But that's one of the cases when to use f22. Another case to use f22 is when you do have this great difference between the foreground and the background, and the situation is like crazy. That it's not easy, or it's quite difficult to like do a focus stack. Like if you're in a storm or something, then and if it's raining a lot, for example, then like doing focus stacking is gonna be more pain in the butt, so to say. So then you might be like, okay, well, I will just use f22. And how my philosophy goes for photography is that it's important the photo is sharp, but sharpness isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is that you actually get the photograph and you focus on what the photograph is saying. So if the situation where you are at is just very tough to take photos in, it might make sense to go with f22, so you will just get the photograph much more likely, and then it makes sense to compromise on the sharpness. So there's a use case for f22 as well. Then make sure you aren't buying the wrong lenses. Especially, I see this with so many landscape photographers. It's crazy, but I don't. It's not your fault if you think of spending like too much on a lens that you wouldn't need, because because there's so much marketing around lenses, and there's a lot of people who do recommend lenses. But that's why, like, when people ask me for lens recommendations, I can't tell you, because it really depends on what kind of photography do you want to do. So that's why when you do take any gear recommendations, you shouldn't blindly just take someone's advice, because they need to understand your context, what you're going to be using that lens for. Most people are not going to need an f2.8. They aren't going to need that. Because when you, for example, photograph landscapes, you probably aren't going to be shooting at f2.8. Now, if you do shoot at night, then yes, it's beneficial, and you might very well consider that lens. But if you use it mainly or only for like golden hour shooting or blue hour shooting or for midday shooting, then an f2.8 might not really be beneficial. Because typically when you photograph landscapes, you want that things are in focus. Like, often it's that everything you want is in focus. And in that point, you aren't going to be using an f2.8 or even f4 or 5.6, you aren't going to be using those f-stops. You are going to be using like an f11 or f13. Like these are like the ones that I go typically with, so f8, f11. So I wouldn't need an f2.8 lens. I don't have an f2.8 lens because I don't need one. I have an f2 lens for night photography, and that's because I need the lower f-stop number so that I can get more light to the sensor of the camera. But I don't have any other f2.8s. I have f4 is the like lowest f-stop number I have in my other lenses. So understand that these lenses like that are 2.8, they typically are much more expensive, and you don't need to spend your money on those. Rather, invest into your skills. Don't invest into gear that you don't actually really benefit from. So think, do you actually need the lower f-stop numbers in your lenses? It can be beneficial if you do shoot indeed in low light, or then like very fast moving subjects, or then you want that like creamy bokeh for some kind of photographs. But typically you don't need a 2.8, and you can just save that money and use it for something else. All right. And then lastly, I want to say that like what I kind of typically go with when it comes to photography, the f-stop numbers, and then also say something else that is very important. So first, what do I typically use? Typically, when taking landscape photos, I aim to use between f8 and f11, about there. And sometimes then I do use a lower f-stop number if I want the foreground is out of focus. Because in some cases you want the foreground is out of focus. For example, if the foreground isn't very interesting, then you don't really want to show it. And then sometimes it can be too distracting. So then when you do get it out of focus, then it's not as distracting. So typically f8 to f11, but then in some case I might go to f4. And I want to say regarding this is that stop overcomplicating this. This can be simple and fun. Most photographers absolutely calculate their focus points, and like they really pixel peep and calculate like, oh, what's gonna be in focus. But this would suck the life, the energy, the fun out of photography. I would hate doing photography if I had to always calculate, oh, where's gonna be the focus point? Is something is gonna be sharp? I don't want to do that. If you're anything like me, you want to keep indeed photography simple and fun, and you don't want to be a math guy when it comes to making photos. Like, no, like we are artists, we aren't these engineers. We don't need to be engineers. So when it comes to choosing an aperture, don't think you need to calculate everything. What I do is I choose an aperture, I take a photo, I see, well, are the things in focus? If they are not, then, oh, cool, well, I'm gonna change it a little bit. That's how I do it. I don't care that everything is perfectly sharp and like calculate things. No, I just take example photos and then I will see what's in focus. And for me, it's good enough if it's enough in focus. That I don't want to be somebody who calculates this stuff. And really, this is how like you should look at the aperture, as well as the other settings. That use an aperture that does fit the purpose, so what you're trying to tell, and then make sure that your exposure is great. But don't calculate and overcomplicate this. It's just a waste of time. All right. Hopefully this video was insightful. If you did find this insightful, then you will also find this video insightful, where I do go through what the pros know about using ISO 100 that most beginners don't know. So watch that next. And make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't yet. Cheers.